You think you know about inter-allied rivalry in World War II, the Americans and the British sniping at each other, the Aussies and the Yanks brawling in Brisbane. But what if I told you there was a single sentence, 7 words spoken in the stinking heat of a jungle command post in September 1942, that lit a fire under the United States Marine Corps, so hot it's still burning today. 7 words that turned professional soldiers into something more dangerous. 7 words that made men walk into machine gun fire, just to prove a point. The insult came from an Australian officer, a decorated veteran of the Western Desert who'd seen Tobruk and Syria, and thought he'd seen everything war had to offer. The man he said it to was a 23-year-old Marine lieutenant from Nebraska who hadn't fired a shot in anger. And the words were simple, devastating, and unforgivable. Send the Boy Scouts home. They're useless. Within 72 hours, that same Marine lieutenant would be directing fire with half his face blown off. His men would take a position that 2 Australian battalions had declared impossible to assault. They would do it with bayonets and grenades, and a kind of suicidal courage that made the Australians who witnessed it question everything they thought they knew about the Americans. This is the story of the insult that created a legend, the moment that defined the Marine Corps' identity in the Pacific, and the Australian who watched it happen and spent the rest of his life trying to take back what he'd said. But by then, it was too late. The Marines had already written it in blood. The thing about Guadalcanal in September 1942 is that nobody thought the Americans would hold it. The Japanese were landing reinforcements every night down the slot. The Marines were running out of ammunition, and disease was killing more men than bullets. Into this nightmare came Major Thomas Ridley of the Australian 2nd Independent Company, a unit that had been operating behind Japanese lines in New Guinea for 8 months. Ridley was 37 years old, a solicitor from Brisbane who'd enlisted in 1940 and discovered he had a gift for unconventional warfare. He'd learned to move through jungle without sound, to kill sentries with his hands, to survive on lizards and rainwater when supply lines collapsed. He'd operated with 24 men against a Japanese division and lived to tell about it. He was lean as a whippet, sunburned to leather, and he didn't suffer fools. Ridley grew up in Paddington, a working-class Brisbane suburb where his father ran a corner shop and his mother took in laundry. He was the second of 5 children. His older brother died of influenza in 1919. Thomas was bright, won a scholarship to Brisbane Grammar School, where the wealthy boys made sure he knew he didn't belong. He learned to fight in alleyways and study by candlelight and keep his mouth shut unless he had something worth saying. He articled at a law firm at 17, qualified as a solicitor at 23, married Catherine Brennan when he was 25. They had 2 daughters by the time war broke out. Catherine was a nurse, practical and tough. She didn't cry when he enlisted. She packed his kit and told him to come home in one piece, because she wasn't raising their girls alone. Ridley joined the 2nd AIF in September 1940 and shipped out to the Middle East with the 6th Division. He fought at Bardia and Tobruk, saw the siege through its worst months, learned that British officers treated Australians like expendable colonials, and that Australian soldiers fought better than anyone gave them credit for. He transferred to the independent companies when they formed in mid-1941, special units designed for reconnaissance and raiding behind enemy lines. The training was brutal. Ridley thrived. He was promoted to captain, then major. When Japan entered the war, his unit was sent to New Guinea. They'd been there since January 1942, watching the Japanese build up for the attack on Port Moresby, radioing intelligence back to Port Moresby, living off the land. Ridley had killed 11 Japanese soldiers personally, 3 with his rifle, 8 with knife and hands. He didn't talk about it. He didn't need to. Everyone who served with him knew what he could do. In late August 1942, Australian High Command pulled Ridley and 2 of his best men, Sergeant Colin Mackay from Cairns and Corporal David Horn from Townsville, out of New Guinea. and sent them to Guadalcanal. The Americans needed experienced jungle fighters to advise on patrolling and defense. The Marine Corps had trained for amphibious assault. Nobody had trained them for what happened after the landing, when you're holding a perimeter in triple canopy jungle against an enemy who owns the night. Ridley and his men arrived on September 8th, aboard a supply run that barely made it through Japanese air attacks. They came ashore at Lunga Point with their personal weapons, no expectations, and a mission brief that amounted to help where you can. The Marines Ridley encountered were not what he expected. He'd seen photographs of them in newsreels, perfect uniforms, parade ground precision, recruiting poster faces. What he found on Guadalcanal were exhausted kids holding a shrinking perimeter around Henderson Field, eating half rations, shitting themselves from dysentery, flinching at every aircraft sound, because they couldn't tell if it was friendly until it started shooting. They were brave enough, Ridley saw that immediately, but they were green. Most of them had never seen combat before the August 7th landing. They dug in where they were told. They fired when ordered, but they didn't have the 1,000 tiny skills that keep you alive in jungle warfare. They crashed through undergrowth like cattle. They bunched up on patrol. They looked up instead of down when they heard movement. They were learning fast, but the Japanese were teaching them with grenades and mortars, and the lessons cost lives. Ridley reported to the 1st Marine Division headquarters, a collection of tents and sandbag dugouts near the airfield. The commanding officer was Major General Alexander Vandergrift, a careful professional who understood his situation was desperate. Vandergrift welcomed the Australian advisors, assigned them to work with the regiment that held the southern perimeter, and made it clear he needed all the help he could get. The regiment was the 1st Marines, and their sector ran from the Lunga River to the Ilu River, a stretch of jungle and kunai grass where Japanese patrols probed the line every night. That's where Ridley met 2nd Lieutenant James Corrigan. Corrigan was 23, from a farm outside Omaha, Nebraska. He'd joined the Marines in 1940 because he wanted to see the world, and his father told him he'd amount to nothing. He was tall, 6'2", with sandy hair and a face that sunburned no matter how much time he spent outside. He'd gone through officer training at Quantico, shipped out to the Pacific in June, and landed at Guadalcanal with the initial assault. He'd been on the island 33 days. He commanded a platoon of 38 men, down from the original 47. Disease had taken 6. Japanese snipers had taken 3. He was earnest and desperately out of his depth, and trying not to show it. Ridley watched Corrigan brief his platoon for a patrol, and saw a dozen things that would get them killed. The briefing was too long. The patrol formation put too many men in the lead. The rally points weren't specific enough. When the Marines moved out, Ridley followed without asking permission. He watched Corrigan lead his men straight through a clearing instead of around it. Watched them cross a stream at the obvious fording point instead of 50 meters upstream where the Japanese wouldn't have a firing position sighted. Nothing happened. That patrol got lucky, but Ridley made notes. That evening he found Corrigan and offered tactful suggestions. The lieutenant listened, nodded, thanked him, and Ridley could see the kid filing it away and trying to process it all. The insult happened 3 days later, on September 11th. A Japanese destroyer run had landed reinforcements the night before. Division intelligence estimated a regiment's strength force was building up east of the Guadalcanal River, preparing for a major assault on the airfield. Vandergrift called a command meeting to discuss defensive options. Ridley attended as an observer. The tent was stifling, maps spread across a folding table, officers sweating through their utilities. The discussion turned to reinforcing the southern perimeter. Someone suggested using Corrigan's platoon and 2 others from the 1st Marines to push forward and establish an observation post closer to the Japanese positions. Ridley spoke up. He didn't usually do that. Advisors were supposed to advise quietly, but what they were proposing was suicide. He said the jungle between the perimeter and the Japanese positions was perfect ambush country. He said 3 platoons wasn't enough strength to fight through if they got hit. He said they didn't have the experience to move that deep into Japanese-controlled territory without getting chewed up. He was trying to be diplomatic. It came out wrong. A colonel from Vandegrift's staff, a regular army officer on temporary attachment, not a Marine, seized on Ridley's comments. The colonel's name was Parker. He was 48, West Point class of 16, and he'd spent the last war in a staff job in Washington. He'd been arguing against the observation post idea for different reasons, and he used Ridley's objections as ammunition. Parker said the Australian was right that the Marines couldn't handle it. He said they were untested and unreliable, and that committing them to an exposed position would end in disaster. He said, and this is where it went to hell, that they should send the Boy Scouts home before they get killed, and we have to explain it to their mothers. The room went silent. Every Marine officer present stiffened like they'd been struck. Parker didn't notice or didn't care. He kept talking, something about proper reconnaissance procedures and the need for more training before committing forces to combat operations. Vandegrift cut him off with a look that could peel paint. But the damage was done. Corrigan was in that meeting. So were his company and battalion commanders. So was Colonel Clifton Cates, who would later command the corps and never forget what Parker said. Ridley tried to clarify. He said he hadn't meant the Marines lacked courage, only that the mission as planned was tactically unsound regardless of who executed it. Nobody was listening. The Marines heard an Australian officer agreeing with an Army colonel that they were Boy Scouts playing soldier. The meeting ended badly. The observation post mission was scrapped, not because of the insult, but because Vandegrift himself agreed it was too risky given the intelligence they had. But the Marines didn't see it that way. They saw their capability questioned. They saw themselves dismissed. Word spread through the 1st Marines within hours. By evening, every man in the regiment knew some Australian had called them Boy Scouts. The story grew in the telling, the way stories do. Some versions had Ridley saying it directly to Corrigan's face. Others had him laughing while he said it. None of that was true, but truth didn't matter. What mattered was the insult had been spoken, and now it had to be answered. Corrigan found Ridley that night near the command post. The lieutenant's face was carefully neutral, but his jaw was tight. He said he understood Ridley had combat experience, and he respected that. He said he appreciated the tactical advice from earlier in the week. Then he said, very clearly, that his Marines weren't Boy Scouts, and if there was going to be an observation post mission, his platoon would take it. Ridley tried to explain what had actually happened in the meeting. Corrigan listened politely and walked away. September 12th and 13th passed in tense waiting. Japanese artillery pounded Henderson Field. Air raids came twice daily. Patrols clashed in the jungle. Then, on September 13th, intelligence reported that a large Japanese force was moving into position for a major assault. The target appeared to be a ridge south of the airfield, a coral spine covered in kunai grass that the Marines called Edson's Ridge, after the colonel who'd fortified it. If the Japanese took that ridge, they'd have direct observation and fields of fire onto Henderson Field. The airfield would become untenable. Guadalcanal would be lost. Vandegrift ordered the ridge reinforced. He sent the 1st Raider Battalion and the 1st Parachute Battalion, his best troops, to dig in along the spine. He also ordered combat patrols forward to disrupt the Japanese assembly areas and gain intelligence on their strength and intentions. One of those patrols would be led by 2nd Lieutenant James Corrigan. His mission was to move 2,000 meters south, locate Japanese positions, engage if the opportunity presented, and return with information. The mission was dangerous. It was also exactly what Corrigan wanted, a chance to prove the Boy Scouts could fight. Ridley heard about the mission and went to Corrigan's company commander. He volunteered to accompany the patrol as an observer. The captain was a pragmatist who wanted his lieutenant to survive. He approved it. Ridley collected Sergeant Mackay. He left Corporal Horn at the command post and reported to Corrigan's assembly area at 0430 on September 14th. Dawn was an hour away. The Marines were checking weapons, adjusting gear, their faces invisible in the darkness. Corrigan acknowledged Ridley with a nod. Nothing more. The lieutenant gathered his men and briefed the mission in a whisper. Ridley noticed the kid had implemented every suggestion he'd made days earlier. The formation was tight. The route avoided obvious danger areas. The rally points were specific. Corrigan had learned fast. They moved out at 0500, 38 Marines and 2 Australians. The jungle swallowed them within 50 meters. Ridley took a position in the middle of the column where he could observe without interfering. Mackay moved with the rear guard. The pace was slow, controlled, each man watching the sectors Corrigan had assigned. They covered 500 meters in the first hour, crossing a stream and climbing a small rise before the jungle thickened into the kind of terrain where visibility dropped to arm's length. The air was already hot, thick with moisture, buzzing with insects. Sweat soaked through utilities within minutes. Nobody spoke. Hand signals only. Ridley approved. At 0730 they reached the first objective, a small clearing where a game trail intersected their route. Corrigan halted the patrol, sent a fire team forward to check the clearing, established security, and waited. Textbook. The clearing was empty. They moved through it and continued south. The jungle changed character, kunai grass giving way to thick secondary growth, the canopy closing overhead until the light turned green and submarine. Ridley's neck prickled. This was perfect ambush country. He caught Corrigan's eye and made a hand signal, danger area ahead. The lieutenant acknowledged and slowed the pace further. They found the Japanese at 0845. The point man froze mid-step, fist raised, then slowly sank into cover. Corrigan moved forward, Ridley behind him. Through the undergrowth they could see a Japanese camp, no more than 30 meters away, with perhaps 40 soldiers visible. They were eating breakfast, weapons stacked, no sentries that Ridley could see. The enemy had gotten sloppy. That happened in the jungle when you thought you owned it. Corrigan eased back to where his platoon waited. He signaled for the squad leaders. They gathered in silence, heads together, and Corrigan laid out the situation in hand signals and whispered syllables. The Japanese camp was a target of opportunity. Regulations said you report it and withdraw. But Corrigan had something to prove. He explained his plan. 2 squads would assault from 2 directions. The third would block the retreat route. They'd hit fast, kill as many as possible, and withdraw before Japanese reinforcements arrived. It was aggressive. It was probably too aggressive for a green platoon. But Ridley understood what was driving it. The Boy Scouts were going to show what they could do. He didn't argue. He positioned himself with Mackay at a firing position that covered the withdrawal route. The attack went in at 0900. Corrigan triggered it himself, shooting a Japanese officer through the head from 20 meters. Then every Marine opened fire at once, and the jungle exploded. The Japanese in the camp died where they sat, cut down by rifle fire and Thompson submachine guns and grenades thrown from close range. The ones who survived the first 5 seconds grabbed weapons and tried to form a defense. They died too. The Marines moved through the position like they'd been doing it for years, not weeks. They didn't bunch up. They covered each other. They shot moving targets with the kind of accuracy that comes from training, and more training, and the knowledge that missing gets you killed. It was over in 90 seconds. Every Japanese soldier in the camp was dead or dying. Corrigan pulled his men back before anyone could get stupid with victory, before the Japanese reinforcements he knew were coming arrived. The Marines withdrew in good order, taking their wounded. 3 men hit, none seriously, and leaving the Japanese position a charnel house. They'd killed 43 enemy soldiers without losing a single Marine. Ridley had seen professional units execute worse assaults than that. He told Corrigan so as they moved north toward friendly lines. The lieutenant didn't respond. His face was tight, adrenaline still flooding his system. He'd just led his first successful combat action, and he couldn't afford to process it yet. They reached Marine lines at 1100 and reported to the company commander. Corrigan's after-action report was concise and accurate. He'd located Japanese positions, engaged an inferior force, and withdrawn without casualties beyond minor wounds. The captain sent him to battalion to brief the operations officer. Ridley accompanied him. Word of the successful patrol spread through the regiment before they'd even finished the debrief. The Boy Scouts had just killed 43 Japanese without losing a man. Maybe they weren't so useless after all. But the real test was still coming. That night, September 14th, Japanese artillery began pounding Edson's Ridge. At midnight, a Japanese regiment attacked the Marine positions in waves, screaming, blowing bugles, firing machine guns from the hip. The Battle of Edson's Ridge, later called Bloody Ridge, would rage for 2 nights and prove to be the decisive engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign. Corrigan's platoon was in reserve when it started. They wouldn't stay there long. The Japanese hit the ridge with everything they had. A full regiment, the Kawaguchi Brigade, reinforced with special naval infantry, attacking uphill against dug-in Marines. The first wave broke through the forward positions. The second wave pushed deeper. By 0200 on September 15th, Japanese infantry had penetrated to within meters of the division command post. Vandergrift committed his reserves. That meant Corrigan. The lieutenant got his orders at 0230. Move to the ridge, report to Colonel Edson, plug the hole in the line wherever Edson sent him. Corrigan roused his platoon. They were already awake, listening to the battle half a mile south, knowing they'd be called, and led them through darkness toward the sound of machine guns and grenades. Ridley and Mackay went with them. Nobody questioned it. The Australians had proved themselves on the morning patrol. If they wanted to walk into a night battle in the jungle, that was their business. The scene on the ridge was chaos that approached nightmare. Flares hanging over the battlefield in garish light, tracers crisscrossing the air, Marines firing from positions so close to the Japanese you couldn't tell whose bodies were whose. The smell of cordite and blood and voided bowels. Wounded men screaming for corpsmen. Artillery falling on both sides, friendly and enemy. Impossible to tell which was which. Corrigan reported to Edson at a command post that was just a shell hole with a radio. The colonel was bleeding from a head wound, his face a mask of blood and coral dust. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He pointed south where the line had broken and told Corrigan to take his platoon and fill it. No support, no reinforcements, just 38 Marines and whatever ammunition they carried. Corrigan led his men into position at 0300. The gap in the line was maybe 70 meters across, covered by Japanese fire from 3 directions. Marines on either flank were holding, but barely. Corrigan didn't try to dig in. No time. He placed his men in whatever cover existed, fallen logs, coral outcrops, shallow scrapes, and told them to shoot anything that moved in front of them. Then the Japanese came again. They attacked at 0330, 2 companies strong, moving uphill through kunai grass toward the gap where Corrigan's platoon waited. The Marines held fire until the enemy was 30 meters away. Then they opened up with everything: rifles, BARs, machine guns, grenades. The Japanese staggered, took casualties, kept coming. They fired back, their light machine guns raking the Marine positions, their riflemen working closer. Men died on both sides. A Marine 3 meters from Ridley took a bullet through the throat and drowned in his own blood before anyone could help him. Sergeant Mackay shot a Japanese soldier who'd gotten within grenade range, then shot another, then had to use his bayonet when a third came over a log straight at him. Corrigan was everywhere at once. He moved from position to position, directing fire, redistributing ammunition, pulling wounded men to cover, shooting enemy soldiers when they got close. He took a bullet through the left shoulder at 0345, but didn't stop moving. He took shrapnel from a grenade at 0410, and still didn't stop. His utilities were soaked with blood, his own and others, and he kept fighting, because stopping meant the line broke, and the line breaking meant the Japanese took Henderson Field. The attack faltered at 0430, when Marine artillery finally found the range and started dropping shells on the Japanese assembly areas. The enemy infantry pulled back to regroup. Corrigan used the lull to reorganize his platoon. He'd lost 9 men, 4 dead, 5 wounded badly enough they had to be evacuated. He redistributed the survivors into 2 squads and prepared for the next wave. It came at 0500. This time the Japanese tried to flank, moving through a ravine to the east. Corrigan shifted half his force to meet them. The fighting devolved into close-quarters savagery, bayonets and rifle butts and grenades at arm's length. A Marine named DeMarco from Pittsburgh killed 3 Japanese with an entrenching tool when his rifle jammed. A Japanese officer got within 5 meters of Corrigan and shot at him twice with a pistol, missing both times, before the lieutenant put half a magazine into him. Dawn came at 0600, and with it air support. Marine dive bombers from Henderson Field hit the Japanese positions south of the ridge, breaking up their formations, killing their officers, destroying their cohesion. The attack collapsed. The Japanese withdrew, leaving their dead in piles around the Marine positions. Corrigan's platoon had held a 70-meter gap against regimental strength for 3 hours. They'd done it with rifle fire and grenades, and a refusal to break that bordered on insanity. When it was over, Corrigan had 16 men still standing. They'd started with 38. Ridley found the lieutenant sitting on a log at 0630, watching corpsmen load bodies onto stretchers. Corrigan's left arm hung useless from the shoulder wound. His face was a mass of cuts and powder burns. He was shaking, delayed shock setting in, but his eyes were clear. Ridley sat next to him without speaking. They watched the sun rise over a battlefield that looked like hell's own landscape. Finally, Ridley said, "I was wrong about you." Corrigan looked at him. Ridley continued, "What I said in that meeting, what that bastard Parker said. You're not Boy Scouts. You're as good as any soldiers I've seen. Better than most." Corrigan's face didn't change expression, but something in his eyes shifted. He nodded once. That was all. Nothing more needed to be said. The Japanese attacked again that night, September 15th into 16th. Different units, same result. The Marines on Edson's Ridge held. They held because men like Corrigan refused to break. They held because units that had been dismissed as Boy Scouts proved they could fight with a ferocity that shocked everyone who witnessed it. By the morning of September 16th, the Kawaguchi Brigade had been destroyed as an effective fighting force. The Japanese lost over 800 dead and withdrew from the ridge. The Marines had saved Henderson Field. The campaign for Guadalcanal would continue for 4 more months. But September 15th was the moment the Japanese lost the island. Corrigan spent 3 weeks in a field hospital recovering from his wounds. The shoulder wound wasn't serious, but it needed surgery to remove bone fragments. The shrapnel wounds were superficial. The blood loss and exhaustion and shock took longer to treat. Ridley visited him twice. The first time Corrigan was barely conscious, drugged and feverish. The second time, a week later, he was sitting up, eating, processing what had happened. They talked about the battle. Corrigan wanted to know about his men, who'd survived, who hadn't, what happened to the wounded. Ridley told him. 7 dead total, 11 wounded seriously enough for evacuation, 20 still with the platoon. The lieutenant took it hard, but he didn't break down. He'd learned that leaders don't break down in front of others. Ridley returned to New Guinea in early October. His advisory mission on Guadalcanal was complete. Before he left, he wrote a report for Australian High Command describing what he'd witnessed. He detailed the Marine defense at Edson's Ridge, the tactical competence they'd shown, the courage they'd displayed. He recommended that Australian units operating in the Pacific seek every opportunity to train with and learn from the US Marine Corps. He specifically mentioned Corrigan's platoon and what they'd accomplished. The report was filed and forgotten, but Ridley kept a copy. Years later, his daughters would find it among his papers and understand some small part of what their father had seen in the war. The insult, "Send the Boy Scouts home," became part of Marine Corps legend. The story circulated through the 1st Marine Division, then through the entire Corps. Details changed in the telling. Some versions had it spoken by a British general, others by Australian infantry who'd fought at Tobruk. A few claimed it came from Army officers jealous of Marine publicity. The Corps remained the same. Someone had dismissed the Marines as useless, and the Marines had responded by fighting with such determination that the insult became a point of pride. They were the Boy Scouts who held Edson's Ridge. They were the kids who beat a veteran Japanese regiment. They were the proof that courage and training could overcome inexperience. Colonel Parker, the Army officer who'd actually spoken the words, left Guadalcanal in late September and spent the rest of the war in administrative positions far from combat. His career never recovered. He retired in 1945 as a colonel, never making general rank. His efficiency reports noting lack of tactical judgment and poor rapport with subordinate units. He died in 1963. His obituary made no mention of Guadalcanal. Corrigan returned to his platoon in November 1942. He fought through the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign, then Cape Gloucester, then Peleliu. He was promoted to captain, then major. He was wounded twice more, neither time seriously. He survived the war and returned to Nebraska in 1946. He didn't talk much about what he'd done. When people asked about his medals, he wore a Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. He deflected the conversation. He married a school teacher named Dorothy, had 4 children, ran the family farm, and lived quietly for 50 years. He attended Marine Corps reunions and stayed in contact with survivors from his old platoon. At the 1982 reunion, someone asked him about the Boy Scouts story. Corrigan confirmed it had happened, confirmed he'd been there, but he wouldn't say who'd spoken the insult. "Doesn't matter anymore," he said. "We proved what needed proving." Ridley stayed in the Australian Army through the end of the war. He commanded independent company operations in New Guinea and Borneo, led raids behind Japanese lines, trained new units in jungle warfare. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1944. He survived the war without serious injury, a statistical miracle given what he'd done, and returned to Brisbane in late 1945. Catherine was waiting. So were his daughters, now teenagers who barely remembered their father. He returned to his law practice, but found it difficult to care about property disputes and contract negotiations after what he'd seen. He drank more than he should have. He had nightmares. Catherine understood without him having to explain. She'd been a nurse in the war. She'd seen what it did to men. In 1963, Ridley received a letter from James Corrigan. The American had tracked him down through Marine Corps records and Australian military archives. The letter was brief. Corrigan said he'd been thinking about Guadalcanal and wanted Ridley to know he'd never blamed him for what happened at that command meeting. He said he understood Ridley had been trying to give sound tactical advice. He said the insult, whoever actually spoke it, had motivated the Marines to prove themselves. And maybe that was worth something. He thanked Ridley for the advice that had kept his patrol alive on September 14th. He said he hoped Ridley had come home to his family and found some peace. Ridley wrote back. He told Corrigan he'd watched the Marines fight on Edson's Ridge and seen courage that still humbled him 20 years later. He said he'd been wrong to suggest they weren't ready for combat operations. He said the Boy Scouts' comment had been the stupidest thing he'd heard spoken by any officer in the entire war, and he was sorry he'd been associated with it even tangentially. He said Corrigan and his Marines had taught him that experience wasn't the same as capability, and that sometimes green troops with the right spirit could outfight veterans who'd forgotten why they were soldiers. The two men corresponded occasionally for the next 15 years. They never met again. Ridley died in 1979, Corrigan in 1996. The Marines never forgot. Every generation of officers and NCOs hears some version of the Boy Scouts story. It gets told at the basic school, at officer candidate training, at staff and co-academies. The details are often wrong, but the lesson is consistent. Never underestimate Marines. Never accept being dismissed. Prove your capability through action, not words. The 1st Marine Division still celebrates Edson's Ridge every September 15th. Veterans gather. Speeches are given. The names of the dead are read aloud. James Corrigan's name is on a plaque at the division headquarters. So are the names of the men from his platoon who died holding that 70-meter gap in the line. Edson's Ridge proved that the Marine Corps could fight and win in conditions that would break other units. It established the Marines as an elite infantry force, not just an amphibious assault capability. It validated the Corps' training methods, their emphasis on small unit leadership, their culture of aggressive action. Every battle the Marines fought after Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, was built on the foundation laid at Edson's Ridge. The Boy Scouts who'd been dismissed in September 1942 became the veterans who taught the next generation how to fight. The insult became motivation. The dismissal became vindication. Thomas Ridley understood that by the end. In one of his last letters to Corrigan, written in 1977, he reflected on what they'd both witnessed. He wrote, "I've thought about that night on the ridge more times than I can count. I've commanded soldiers and trained soldiers and studied warfare for most of my adult life. I've never seen anything to match what your Marines did at Edson's Ridge. They were green kids who'd been on the island a month, facing veteran Japanese infantry in night combat over broken terrain. And they didn't break. They didn't retreat. They held because surrender wasn't in them. That's not training. That's something else. Whatever we said about them before that battle, we were wrong. They were never Boy Scouts. They were Marines." The Japanese perspective on Edson's Ridge reinforces how significant the Marine defense was. Documents captured after the war showed that Colonel Kiyonao Kawaguchi believed his September 15th attack would break through to Henderson Field. His intelligence indicated the Marines were exhausted, demoralized, and close to collapse. His regiment was experienced, well-equipped, and confident. They'd fought in China and the Dutch East Indies and never been stopped. The defense they encountered shocked them. Japanese survivors reported that the Marines fought with a savagery they hadn't expected from American troops. They reported that Marine units that should have broken held their positions beyond any reasonable expectation. They reported casualties that made continued offensive operations impossible. Kawaguchi was relieved of command and sent back to Japan in disgrace. His brigade ceased to exist as a combat-effective unit. The numbers tell part of the story. At Edson's Ridge, Approximately 800 Japanese soldiers died attacking positions held by fewer than 800 Marines. The Marines lost 104 killed and 278 wounded. They inflicted casualties at a ratio that should have been impossible for a defending force of roughly equal strength against attacking infantry. They did it by fighting from prepared positions with interlocking fields of fire, by refusing to panic when the line was penetrated, by counterattacking when most units would have fallen back, and by maintaining discipline under conditions that should have produced chaos. But numbers don't explain why Corrigan's 38 Marines held that gap for 3 hours against company strength attacks. Numbers don't explain why wounded Marines kept fighting when they could have legitimately withdrawn for medical treatment. Numbers don't explain why every Marine on that ridge knew what failure meant. The loss of Henderson Field, the loss of Guadalcanal, maybe the loss of the entire campaign. And fought accordingly. That kind of performance comes from something deeper than training or tactics. It comes from unit cohesion, from trust in the men beside you, from the knowledge that your service's reputation rides on what you do in the next 5 minutes. The Boy Scouts' insult gave the Marines something to prove. Edson's Ridge was where they proved it. The legacy extends beyond military history. The Marine Corps used Guadalcanal and specifically Edson's Ridge in recruiting campaigns for decades. Posters showed Marines in jungle combat. Radio ads referenced the battle. Training films showed reenactments. The message was consistent. The Marines fight and win against overwhelming odds. Join them, and you'll be part of that tradition. It worked. Enlistment surged. The Corps that had struggled to maintain authorized strength in the 1930s became one of the most selective services in the American military. Men wanted to be Marines because Marines had proved themselves in the worst conditions imaginable and prevailed. That cultural impact matters because it shaped how the United States fought the Pacific War and every war since. The Marine Corps became the force you sent when conventional wisdom said the mission was impossible. They became the unit that took objectives other services couldn't or wouldn't attack. Tarawa, Iwo Jima, the Chosin Reservoir, Hue City, Fallujah. Every one of those battles reinforced the reputation established at Guadalcanal. The Marines didn't win because they were better equipped or better supported. They won because their culture wouldn't accept failure, and their history proved they could do the impossible if pushed hard enough. The Boy Scouts' insult became part of that culture, a reminder that dismissal and underestimation were challenges to be met with action. Australian and American military cooperation in the Pacific was transformed by mutual respect earned through combat. The tensions that had existed in 1942, Americans thinking Australians were colonial amateurs, Australians thinking Americans were inexperienced showboats, disappeared as both forces proved themselves against the Japanese. Ridley's experience at Guadalcanal was repeated hundreds of times. Australian officers who dismissed the Americans learned to respect their capability. American officers who'd ignored Australian advice learned to listen. By 1943, Australian and American units were coordinating operations with the efficiency that comes from genuine professional regard. That didn't happen because of directives from higher command. It happened because men like Ridley watched Marines like Corrigan fight and recognized equals. The final accounting of the Boy Scouts' insult shows how a moment of stupidity produced unexpected consequences. Colonel Parker meant to criticize a tactical plan. He insulted an entire service instead. The Marines responded by fighting with extraordinary courage at Edson's Ridge and proving their capability beyond any doubt. The insult became motivation. The motivation produced performance that exceeded any reasonable expectation. That performance established the Marine Corps as an elite force. That reputation attracted better recruits and better support and better opportunities to prove themselves again. A dismissive comment spoken in anger in a stifling tent on Guadalcanal helped shape the modern United States Marine Corps. Thomas Ridley witnessed that transformation beginning. He saw green troops become combat veterans in 72 hours. He saw young officers like Corrigan learn under fire and emerge as combat leaders. He saw a unit that had been questioned prove itself against a determined enemy on ground that favored the defender, and in conditions that broke other forces. He saw the Marines write their reputation in blood and fear, and the kind of stubborn courage that refuses to acknowledge defeat. He spent the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen that the US Marine Corps was the finest infantry force he'd encountered in 6 years of war. He said it in Australia, where some people thought he was exaggerating. He said it at reunions and in letters and in the memoirs he never published. He said it because he'd seen it and he knew it was true. James Corrigan never called himself a hero. He deflected credit to the men he'd led. When his children asked about his service, he'd mention Guadalcanal briefly and change the subject. But in private moments with fellow Marines who'd been there, he'd acknowledge what Edson's Ridge had meant. They'd been dismissed as Boy Scouts. They'd proved themselves as Marines. That validation mattered more than any medal or promotion. It mattered because it established who they were, not just to others, but to themselves. They were the men who'd held the line when holding it seemed impossible. They were the proof that courage and determination could overcome inexperience and fear. They were Marines, and nobody would ever question that again. The insult that the US Marines would never forget became the compliment they never needed to speak. Send the Boy Scouts home? The Marines did go home eventually, after Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester and Peleliu and Okinawa. They went home having fought across the Pacific against an enemy that gave no quarter and expected none. They went home having taken islands and held perimeters and executed amphibious assaults that military historians still study as examples of operational excellence. They went home having lost friends and brothers and parts of themselves that would never fully heal. But they went home as Marines, and that identity had been forged at places like Edson's Ridge, where Boy Scouts became warriors and insults became legend. Thomas Ridley watched it happen. James Corrigan lived it. And 70 years later, the lesson endures. Never underestimate people who have something to prove. They just might prove it in ways that change history.